It's my pleasure to welcome Christopher Phillips back to the library. Chris has been here many times, hasn't been here in a while, so I'm really happy that he could pay us a visit. This program tonight is being sponsored by the Friends of the Takoma Park Maryland Library.
Give him a hand.
Chris uses interactive discussion and the Socratic method to explore existential problems, and tonight to examine our Constitution in terms of what it says and what it should say in the light of issues that are of pressing concern in today's society. Mm-hmm. Chris is the founder and executive director of the nonprofit Democracy Café, dedicated to making ours a more inclusive, reasonable, and thoughtful world. He is the author of books including Constitution Café, Jefferson's Brew for a True Revolution, as well as the bestseller Socrates Café, A Fresh Taste of Philosophy. And I'd like to mention before we start, because this is an interactive discussion, when you speak, you should either go to this mic or that mic over there, or I can pass around this mic, whatever works best for you. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Here's my first book. Look at this. Anybody ever read it, or am I just a legend in my own mind? No? Who's read it? Did you read it? Can I quiz you on it? I'm going to quiz you on it later.
A few copies.
Awesome.
3 copies at least.
Cool. Yeah, I'm so glad that they have. This came out 16 years ago, and I'm still kicking.
That's great.
There's a section in this book called What's Love Got to Do with It? And talks about how I had one Socrates Café in 1996 when I was just starting and only one person came. And that person's now my wife. I'm doing everything late in life. I had my first child at 47, and she's almost 11, and my second at 54. So she's she'll be 4 on our real Independence Day, which is July the 2nd. That's when Congress declared, our Continental Congress declared independence. Chris, I know you know that. You're like a history buff. So I don't know if y'all, how many have come to one of my gatherings here before? You have. Rob and I go way back. We were in the same dormitory at the University of Virginia in 1977, and we've managed to still keep speaking to each other. We lived in Takoma Park together for some time. That was a lifetime ago. I can't. It's been about 20 years, over 20 years, right? Yeah. So it was only after I moved and was living in the Bay Area of California that I was here visiting, and I visited the children's librarian at the time, Jillian Hirschberger. Y'all remember Jillian? She's my Facebook friend. And I was having trouble finding libraries in the Bay Area that would let me do this. They would tell me things like, oh, it's just too much trouble to set up, and all these things. So I asked Jillian. She was here that day, and I said, can I do it here? She goes, of course. So I started flying back and forth from California just to do this. And so I've been coming here now to hold dialogues since, gosh, close to the time I started. I would think since about 1998 I've come on. I was so grateful that, Ellen, that y'all still liked having me back. And with the last time I was here, it's been about 5 years, and I was holding part of my book, Constitution Café, had come out, and we were sort of putting the Constitution under the microscope. So now it's 5 years further down the road, and it's been interesting. Since January 20th or so, I don't know what happened then, but I've been getting a lot of emails saying, Chris, can you come back and let's talk more about political things? Let's look at the Constitution, maybe not just with a microscope, but with a magnifying glass as well. And so I've been gallivanting across the fruited plain doing that a little bit differently than how I did it with my Constitution Café book. I'm trying to also look at more big picture issues that have to deal with open societies. Anybody who knows, if you go to our website, I hope you will, at democracycafe.org, I don't do debate. I don't do argument. What I do is exploration and inquiry, where we use a method to sort of see where we land, see if we open up some new portals of discovery as we express our views and share our views and develop our views more than we would in a typical conversation. So we tell each other what the story is behind the view that we have arrived at for now. I find it transformative just to really listen with all my heart and mind with what somebody says, especially if their view is alien to mine. I find it a very thrilling experience to, if somebody just tells me a view and I find it off-putting, you'll see my body language sort of go like this. But if I suddenly go, well, what's your story behind getting where you are right now? Suddenly I'm leaning in and listening. And I think that what our world needs a lot more of is just really good listeners. And maybe then we'll be more open at arriving at not just compromise or consensus, but maybe even higher ground together. Luckily, since I started Socrates Café back in '96, we've all come together as one. The American people, no? Is that? No? But we have hundreds of groups now. No? No, am I off base? Am I living in my own rose-colored Pollyanna-ish world? Oh dear. So, there's a lot of people concerned. And so, I have dual citizenship with the U.S. and Greece, so my yaya, my Greek grandmother, she and my grandfather immigrated through Ellis Island in 22, just before they curtailed any further immigration from so-called Southern Italians and Greeks, which meant poor people from those countries. They didn't want them anymore. Congress passed a law in 23. So they got here so she became the first Greek teacher of Greek language and culture in the Tampa Bay region of Florida. And she sort of indoctrinated me on all things Greek. So I come by this honestly. But to me, the key is just really careful listening and wanting to sort of push ourselves a little bit further and dig a little deeper and just see where we arrive at. Maybe with the idea that just by becoming more connected, maybe we'll want to be more engaged in some way in civic life. So what I've been looking at lately is what I've been calling, a lot of people have been saying that the system is rigged, that our democratic system is rigged. Does anybody buy that? Do you believe that it is in some way? So? You do? Tell me about it. Oh, I forgot about that.
So I grew up in Appalachia, and if you were a miner, so you would go to work, but before that, you owned your own land. But at some point along the line, they kind of didn't tell you the whole facts. They bought your land for nothing,
Mm-hmm.
and now you're working for them on the land that used to be yours. And so it's been rigged since, I guess, 1910.
From where you're from?
Yeah.
It's been rigged. And how's that affected democracy itself? There's a handheld. Let me give you that one over here so he doesn't have to, every time and I'll just sort of.
It might be better to use a darker pen. It's hard to.
Oh, it's not working at all. Thank you. This is a little dry. Let me see if I can find. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So this is, okay, go ahead, Rob.
Well, so for me, it was always about, it's going to be very difficult for a person from my neighborhood to succeed in life. And when you would go away to, say, a big university, you might come in and people would be down the hall and they would be talking all about this crazy Appalachian who's got the room down the street and down the hall there, So, but even though the systems may be somewhat rigged,
Mm-hmm.
I made it work for me.
You did? And you owe me. I'm just kidding.
Well, I think one thing that where it's like a meritocracy in America is if you study science, because then it's about what you know and not about who you know. So.
Okay. Well, it was interesting. Before the election was held, and it looked like Donald Trump was going to lose, he was complaining in advance to get people riled about how the system was rigged against him. And he was convinced he was not going to win. And then just before the election, a lot of WikiLeaks things came out that basically showed that the Democratic Party didn't really want Bernie to have a snowball's chance of actually garnering the nomination. So there were people on the left complaining about the system rigged and pointing to that WikiLeaks evidence. And then there was him using lots of different, I'm not even sure if it was backed up by any specific thing, but also complaining that the system was rigged. And so I've been wondering, do you think, I mean, does our Constitution itself lead to a system in which candidates can throw their hat in the ring to be in the highest office in the land and really have a legitimate chance of garnering the nomination? Is the system itself okay? I mean, the Republican Party, say what you want to about Donald Trump. They did, he wasn't their chosen one, but he did garner the nomination. Seems like things are still in more of a molten state with, I see you have your Bernie shirt on, with the Democratic Party that, and I still wonder to this day if they would have allowed him, even now, if we had a remove to garner the nomination.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that, but everything that I hear, I'm sorry. Everything that I hear now, and
Is that working?
No, it doesn't amplify, but it goes into the...
okay, go somewhere. What am I going? There's something
It's not working, it's working.
It is working.
Okay, but I'm now thinking about the English, the Great Britain election, and Jeremy Corbyn wasn't expected to win because he was a Bernie Sanders type. Whatever that means, and I'm not clear what that means, because if you want to put the label progressive on people, I see that only as a willingness to help others. And I'm not I feel that in our country, we've kind of lost, I feel as though we've lost sight of it, given various pieces of legislation that have been passed in recent years.
Like what?
Well, we won't even talk about the healthcare system, but the struggle, just think about the Affordable Care Act, the struggle with getting this very simple thing passed. Well, not simple, there's nothing simple about it. But the notion of getting this passed, so much resistance to it, always under the guise of it's going to cost too much money, when I only saw it as an argument against spreading out health care to all in need. And I don't see what the problem is with that. If we had the will to do it, it could be done.
Okay. I mean, one of the...
That's sort of off.
No, but in terms of, you were talking about progressive.
Yes.
So Jeremy Corbyn actually waged such an impressive campaign in the UK that a lot of people who were called sort of Blairites, so now they're suddenly sort of coming his way.
But the story with that is it's being quote unquote blamed because the younger generation participated more. So I don't know if there's a generational divide or what the story is, but I think there isn't a blame, but he won. He got more votes because the younger generation became involved. And that was the same thing with Bernie Sanders.
I said that's positive.
That's a positive thing.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it.
Okay. Because here's the thing. Okay, my Constitution Café book looked at, do you want to say anything else?
I was just going to say, I think that, I don't know, I think the system is, the way it's structured now, not the essential portion of the system, but the way it has ended up working in the United States is rigged because it's based on money. Only wealthy people can win. And it's just an unfortunate fact. Only wealthy people can, at this point, control how the Health Care Act is going to go. Only wealthy people control immigration because people who are in Congress, people who are in the White House are extraordinarily wealthy and become more so as they supposedly serve.
Okay. So let's assume that, our Constitution says nothing whatsoever about how, it doesn't say anything about political parties. It didn't even assume that there was going to be this advent of political parties, much less that, unlike Britain, which has a number of viable parties, there'd just be two. We had many more at the outset, but it just became two. It doesn't say anything about political primaries, presidential primaries, about how they can be waged. So let's assume that there's not a snowball's chance in Hades that we're going to have a constitutional amendment of any sort. Is there any way we can unrig the system without any changes to our Constitution, because it ain't going to happen, that makes it so that money isn't such an end-all, be-all in determining things?
If you look at least some countries in Europe, Britain and France, they limit the length of the election time. So you could only run for 6 weeks or 2 weeks or whatever it is, 3 months. But these years and years of electioneering is very, very expensive. Very expensive.
Yeah. Yes.
So is a corporation a person with rights? I mean, should there be, is speech money?
Right. I mean, I
Those
know
are
our
problems. I mean, right there.
I know our
Speech is
founders
not
never
money.
anticipated that corporations would have rights akin to people.
People later.
Huh. But is there anything that we can do? Let's just assume, and not negatively, but let's assume that we're not going to be able to make any changes to our. Is there anything that we, the people, can do, given the Constitution that we have, that can make it so money isn't such a prevalent influence in elections?
Well, people are doing it in that they're trying to get another constitutional convention called, which presumably would overturn Citizens United, which is...
That certainly is the reason that they're using to call for a constitutional convention.
The question is, can you do anything about this without... Because, you know, everything we want, the opposite is provided by Citizens United.
Yeah. We could certainly, would it even take a law to limit the times, that amount of time that elections are waged?
If it didn't take a law, it would take the will of those in office.
And they like things.
They like will just the way it is.
Yeah. Well, let's do some brainstorming here. Yes.
I just wanted to say that you can get around the money issue if you could get everyone to vote. The question is,
This thing's it's not really amplifying.
It's for this.
Okay, well.
I see,
well,
yeah.
the question, you could get around the money issue if you could get everyone to vote. The question is, how do you involve people who are just turned off by the system, who feel that it's rigged against them and don't feel that their vote counts? But there's, when you look at the numbers of people that vote, it's really low for.
Well, you talked about Bernie. Somebody has talked about Bernie Sanders and young people. So, for instance, every poll showed that he was going to lose Michigan by double digits, and he won. And people came out in droves and voted for him. Yeah, yeah. So, what was it about that got people out? You know, that made that difference. It doesn't seem, but they didn't come out and vote for the final election. They didn't come out. A million stayed home and said that, you know, I thought she had it in the bag, so I'm not going to vote, or for other reasons that they just weren't inspired enough, as much as they might have really felt anathema, you know, for the other candidate. They just weren't inspired to come out and vote. Let me give that to you.
But how do you know that in view of all the talk about vote counting falsification? And
Have you seen any evidence of that?
no, but I haven't been looking hard either.
I have. There hasn't been an iota of anything that is concrete. Have you seen anything about voting? Voter suppressing, but of who? Of who? Okay, of people of. Okay. Were you talking also about democratic possibilities, or just a more broader claim?
A broader claim, as yours makes a broad claim, that people just didn't do anything.
What do you think about that?
I tend to believe in voter suppression, vote falsification.
There was.
Yeah, I do. I tend to trust those sources.
Okay.
And
Well,
I don't have concrete evidence.
okay. Well, what were you going to say? Yours was more about how some were intimidated and deliberately suppressed rather than people who came out to vote who really shouldn't have been voting.
Sure, like I don't know, because the state law varies, and I don't have any clue about what happens in other states. But I know that, like, I think it might be Texas, where you can't use a student ID, but you can use a like a gun registration, whatever to be able to vote.
People who may not necessarily have the kind of IDs that and the people who are requiring certain IDs knows that certain folks don't have them.
Right.
Keeps them from definitely coming out.
Yeah, and I mean, there are so many things that could be done if voting was on the weekend, if it was a national holiday, if people were automatically registered to vote. I mean, obviously, the powers that be on the right don't want people to vote. So that's why we don't have those things. We can't have nice things.
I mean, I got my PhD in Australia, and you're fined mightily if you don't vote. You have to vote there. What do you think about that?
Well,
about actually being, is that too coercive? Some people say, no, we're a democracy. We should have the freedom whether to vote or not. They don't get 100% turnout, but they get in the high 90s typically, because you pay a steep price if you don't vote there.
What is the steep price?
I don't know. I didn't vote.
Oh, no.
But
Was there
So you should have been fine.
yeah, but they're fined. They've received a very high fine. So it must be high enough where people feel like they got to come out and vote. So they're like, if you turn on the regular news there, it's much more detailed and nuanced than anything you'll get here by and large. I was really impressed with just the regular major media news programs there. Just very much more detailed issues, because if you do have to vote, I guess people actually feel more inclined to learn more about the issues. But do you think that's going too far to actually have to vote? You don't.
I think that you don't have to. You have to turn up. You don't have to put your check by somebody
Right.
if you feel you really don't know.
Uh-huh.
But the fact that you turn up to vote means that
I mean, these are things that could be passed without any sort of constitutional amendment. How many of you would support an idea of, and just by show of hands, of making it mandatory to vote in federal election? You really would?
Why not?
Would you? Are you who was kind of not so sure that's a great idea? How come? And then I'm going to come back this way.
I would rather see other efforts to get people out to vote before that. I mean, I think there are ways of doing it, making voting on Sundays, for example,
Right.
so that it's easier for people. It doesn't interfere with work. There was something on the radio today on a talk show called 1A that mentioned a historic black college in Atlanta, where the band marched from the school to the local polling place, and all the kids came with it to vote. I mean, that kind of enthusiasm, that kind of peer pressure, that voting is something we do, I think is far better than a law.
Okay, so something.
But what about this early voting thing? That's an incentive, but doesn't seem to work.
Well, the one thing that I've been told about the early voting thing is that if something happens between that early vote and the time of the final vote, like the guy in Montana who body slammed a report. I'm not laughing. I just can't believe these are the times we're living in. But they might have changed the outcome. So a lot of people are thinking, well, maybe it's better not to have that sort of gradated thing where you can vote a lot. Yes?
I was just going to comment that I think showing up really making sure that people show up, because showing up actually matters. And so the habit of you need to show up, and then the system has to accommodate everybody. You go, we're expecting, 100% turnout. How are we going to accommodate that so that the system is actually set up to accommodate everyone rather than just accommodating the groups of people that they think they might want to accommodate? I mean, I think that would be the virtue.
Well, I've heard two things lately. Is that, okay, I don't know if you noticed in the Britain, in the elections there that they still vote with just pencils and they fill out because they want a paper trail. Most of our systems now are electronic. Many of them don't even have a paper trail, and most do not even use the paper trail if they do have one to verify what they're getting from the electronic system. And the other one is that I get, especially from young people, is I would vote if I had a candidate that I was excited about. But look at what WikiLeaks shows, that Bernie didn't have a chance from the very beginning, that they weren't going to let him garner the nomination. So what?
I didn't see that.
Yeah. Did anybody else besides me see that? It was on, or am I pushing it too far? What do you think?
Well,
Thank you, Rob.
people-
Thanks for putting me on.
People have very different interpretations
Okay.
of what happened.
Sure.
And, you know, I don't think that the problem is that our voting laws aren't good enough. There's a lot we can do, and it would help to make voting easier. Seems like no reason not to do those things. But I don't think passing a law that would make everybody vote. I mean, there are dictatorships where everybody votes.
Sure,
Everybody has
absolutely.
to. And
Absolutely.
it doesn't, you need an electorate that has a lot of things, that cares, that discerns, that thinks, that has been given the tools to think. I mean, I think we're at a much more basic and, you know, I would say primitive level of in electoral sophistication here because of our weaknesses in those ways.
How many of you were excited to come out and vote on election day? How many of you felt like, you know, we have really good choices?
It was a good choice. It was a good choice. Put it that way.
There was a choice.
Let's tell me what you have to say.
I wasn't going to say so much about election day.
Okay, we'll say whatever.
But no, I mean, I can imagine for some, it's hard not to be cynical about will my vote count after gerrymandering where, you know, there's an intention to suppress certain voter groups. There are efforts to make it harder to vote. You know, I mean, really the orientation should be towards how can we make it as convenient as possible for as many people to vote as possible, as opposed to how can we make it as inconvenient for people to vote and to try to not prejudge, but set the voting districts in a way that determines some of the outcome. So I can see where people could be quite cynical and turned off that, you know, their vote matters.
How was it in Takoma Park? Were y'all satisfied with the voting precincts? And
Well, we do have paper ballots.
you do have paper. You do.
We do.
It's a nice community experience.
I'm going to. Yes.
Let me I have to
No,
hold
okay.
on to this a little bit.
I can hold it.
Okay. By the way, when everybody uses this, put yourself close to the mic so that it works better. But anyway, I want to say this is a place where the problem with corporate pressure and the voting problem really come together, because there's been a lot of pressure to keep people from voting, and it's was done. I don't think the Democratic Party was trying to keep people from voting. I do think the other party was. I think if it could be, if the mentality of the country could be changed so that there was a general consensus that voting was indeed a great thing, it was one's duty as a citizen to do, then I think that would be wonderful. We need to start working on how can we do that. And the gerrymandering, however, is a constitutional problem now because of what happened through the Koch brothers and through a whole process where the boundaries were changed to make them more homogeneous and make it more difficult to get
a broader.
And the court is actually striking down some of the arrangements that were made,
Really? Oh, that's great. To
which
know.
is pretty. Yeah, what were you saying?
I was just going to say, I find voting a nice community experience. I always see neighbors. It's just kind of an upbeat, you know, I find it fun personally. But.
I just wanted to kind of agree with what was said here. I think almost that voting is too late. That we need to attack this. We need to recreate citizenship.
Tell me more about that.
Well, I think we do not have the aspects of citizenship that, you know, were kind of reviewed or foreseen, if you want to put it this way, by the founding fathers. I mean, I don't think the founding fathers is perfect either, you know, but what was foreseen was people who were responsible individually for taking in information, making a choice, so that they were somehow fairly directly or reliably informed, and that they could actually do something with that. But, you know, now we obviously have, you know, at the head of our government, somebody that doesn't care about information at all.
Well, okay, let's look at that for a minute. Okay,
he hardly cares about information.
Well, let's look at this notion of information. I really tell me your name. Reed. I like what you said about. Sound like a school teacher. I like what you said. No, exactly. Now everybody say what Reed said. If you don't get that me saying that, that means I don't. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so recreating citizenship by taking in information. So there was an article in The Guardian. I read The Guardian a lot. I get more perspective sometimes from across the water on what's going on, or BBC, than I do sometimes in our papers here. And it was talking about how gazillions of dollars were spent. So even though maybe the president himself doesn't give a hoot, but there's those within the web who have donated, for instance, who have spent tens of millions in an orchestrated campaign to get us to doubt the evidence that points to global warming, to climate change. So how do you know that the information, how can you know that the information, and they typically often go through legitimate news sources as the conduits for that. How can you know how do you know whether or feel whether you're getting the kind of legitimate, reliable information you do need to make an informed choice, as you so eloquently put it? Yeah.
Well, I'd say, first of all, from what Jill said, that we need to have the best education
system we have and the most informed electorate, which is most able to take in information. That would be the first thing that we need to do.
Okay.
Oh. So there's a question on some people as whether or not the masses are capable of ruling themselves. Now, I did a class in college, and I thought, well, maybe I think they are. But some people took the other side of the argument that the masses really aren't capable of governing themselves, and so you need.
Are you talking about your undergraduate or your graduate?
Undergraduate,
Yeah.
yes. Okay, but
you went to UVA and studied
political and social thought.
Yeah.
Yes.
He's showing off. No, just go ahead.
Well, we
are.
I say we are. But some people were saying that we aren't. That really what the Constitution anticipated was basically for the nobles to rule us, because they're learned, they're like citizen philosophers. They have all this leisure time to develop science and all this stuff. And so, so I thought one thing that maybe the hope of the future was the information technologies which we have today. And that was brought out by this book called Future Shock, where it says that at some point we're going to be so connected to each other that we can communicate almost instantaneously on our political issues. And okay, so I marched on the Women's March, and I still on this Women's March app, and I communicate almost hourly with people from all over the United States about my complaint about the latest tweet, or the Comey or something like that. So maybe we're at the brink of this promised land.
Oh, that's a good question.
I think on the news they were talking about a classroom, and I think in California, where they were teaching children how to recognize false news. And I think that we all need to be educated as to recognize false news and how to think and the tricks of journalism. I think we all need to go through an education program.
So interestingly, on my Facebook page, some of my friends were posting stuff that they took for gospel, and it turns out that it wasn't true. Did anybody sort of fall for anything that turned out to be false news or fake news? Or any, you did? Yeah. But how do you, so you said, is there a way, because we're in this world of fake news, alternative facts, and even when the news isn't deliberately skewed, maybe it's just really diluted and so short we have very short attention spans today. But I think you are gainsaying that by coming here and taking part in this.
Don't be so sure.
There's always an exception to that. No, but is there some way? How would do we educate ourselves? What was?
They said first that you look at that little string across the top and look for its legitimacy and for extra letters and stuff. The other was there were certain buzzwords that they would use to get people worked up, like ones that were not. Like they would use them, like sensational words to pull you in. And there were about 5 or 6 other things that they mentioned. I'm sure there's a lot more. They couldn't give a lot in a short news program, but that I thought was interesting.
So how many of you feel like you do get that you do have an ample choice of legitimate sources to make informed decisions about things? You do? Like, where do you go? If you don't mind me putting you on the spot.
Well, I'd say for general mental orientation, I go to a website called Human Journey, which is really oriented toward making judgments, using your mind to reach good decisions. And I find that a lot of things that people discover about, for example, pushing your buttons with the sensational journalism, that's built into our evolutionary patterns of thought. And of course we do that, but if you practice, you learn to recognize that I'm reacting emotionally. I'm not reacting in a reasonable way. But then there are some good sites, but I'd probably pick and choose because it mainly depends on the journalist.
Depends on the journalist.
Right, yeah.
There's ones you consider more reliable and...
Yeah. But generally, I think it's the ones, for example, I like a lot of the articles I've read in the New Yorker, although every now and then I feel like they're getting kind of manipulative too. But I think there's a lot more of just, I think, understanding your own ability to digest information and sort it out. And I think a class in that is a wonderful idea. I feel like that's been a theme of my life. I mean, just be able to use information in a way that works.
Well, one thing I've been hearing from teachers is that the people above them now are they're curtailing programs on civics education. They'll find programs, kids are interested in, they say, in coding, but not coding for democracy. The civics education class that I took at the school I went to in Newport News no longer exists. So it might have been even for me a little bit like pulling teeth back then, but I remember that stuff. But what do you do in an era when so many civics education programs in public schools are being curtailed? Not just necessarily for budgetary issues, but they're being replaced and supplanted by something else.
Well, we should have religious schools. You can use vouchers.
But is it up to we the people to insist? Yeah.
See, if you want America to have democracy, try to take it away from them. And that's what we feel like right now. They're trying to take it away from us, and they will not get it.
Do a lot of you feel that way? That the democracy, there's a real orchestrated attempt to wrest it from us?
Yeah.
I
was just going to say, I think it's not just teachers who have to instill that in children. It's parents also. And I, as a teacher and as a parent, I get irritated on either side of the fence, that parents can't just turn over to the schools and say, well, you never taught my child this. Parents have to teach it too.
So it's a many-way street.
Yeah, and
It's not
parents
just,
do not have to be civics teachers to teach it. They take them to the polls with them. They let the kids know they're going to polls. They talk about articles and interesting things at the table.
I've actually found young people sometimes to be more astute on the issues than folks my age. That whether they get it from home or other places. When I was writing Constitution Café, Obama, it was right after President Obama had given his speech about education and talked about how every child deserves a world-class education. I went to a school that looked like a bomb had hit it. And his speech was beamed into them. And they said, well, I just want to be able to go to school like his kids go to. I don't want to have to worry about whether I'm going to get home safely from walking. I mean, the books are old. It's a depressing environment, even though they're often quite impassioned teachers. But is that part of sort of getting people more, if they feel like things are just so out of kilter? Y'all had talked about money issues, class discrepancies, and things like that.
I sort of disagree with, because I do think the schools have total responsibility of teaching these things.
You do.
And I think that often I've taught in very poor schools, and the kids
Are you a teacher?
I used to be.
Used to be, okay.
Years ago.
Yes, I was too.
And students will then often go back and educate their parents, but you can't expect a parent who had little or no education to be the mentor in some of these things. And I think it's time to, if you want to reverse those communities, you have to, I think, start with the children and have them basically go back and teach their parents. And if you're a good, there's lots and lots of problems, and I quit teaching because it's frustrating. But I had other interests, and you do want parent involvement as much as you can, but a lot of these parents are so drugged out, etc., that you just have to sometimes throw up your hands and say, I can't always have the parent participation. But anyhow, I think that's important. I also think that this is supposed to be one of the better school systems in the country, in Montgomery County, and yet our teachers often suppress discussion. When the Iraq War broke out, the teacher of my daughter's class refused to let there be any discussion of the Iraq War and its rights or wrongs for worries about offending kids whose parents were over there. A teacher should be able to carry a discussion that's decent and respectful. But if we can't learn to discuss issues, part of what's true and what's not true in terms of news, you have to listen to all sides and then help make your own decisions. But, if we don't have a discussion, we don't have a democracy.
If we don't have a discussion, we don't have a democracy. A lot of schools that I go to, I'm told before entering the class, don't talk about God and don't talk about politics. And guess what immediately comes up? And sometimes I don't get invited back, but I let them talk about what's on their minds and hearts, because that's on their minds, and they don't have a chance typically in the normal school day. And they're very thoughtful. They don't want to be in debate mode. They just want to explore these things thoughtfully. But I also started out, I was a teacher in a 6-room schoolhouse in rural Maine at middle school, taught 37 kids per class. But the thing that was most meaningful to all of us was when we would have these weekly readers. We'd read up on the social issues, and then we'd have circle discussions about them. Some of them lived in abandoned school buses in Maine in the winter, those kinds of things. But sometimes, like you said, the kids who read these things, they bring them home, and they maybe make their parents privy to things that they otherwise. But is it up to all of us parents and the childless alike to want these things in our school and to advocate for these things? Yes.
I think it definitely is, and I think we need to work for some kind of social compact, which on one side makes everyone required to vote. I never heard of that idea from Australia, but it sounds like a good one to me, and matches that up with everyone getting the world-class education that a citizen needs.
Compact. You mentioned that's the first time that word's come up here. There's a group that's an amalgam of universities called Campus Compact, where it's about instilling sort of social conscience, a sense of civic engagement again among young people. Our nation was founded on things like the Mayflower Compact. At our origins, we're a society of compacts. Have we lost that sense of compact? At a more foundational level? Even forgetting about the Constitution for now, but just, do we have to somehow begin and get back to that notion that we have some sort of shared compact, even if and as we differ on specifics? Yes.
I think some of that's going on at the city and state and sometimes regional level, especially where these areas are most recently are voting for climate change, despite the president are making a statement that California, Oregon, Washington, New York, maybe Maryland favor climate change. And the city movement, likewise, it does a lot of very progressive things. So I think that good things happen on a local level, and it's good increasing.
So we would start from the bottom up.
Of course. Good.
You say of course.
Yeah.
Why do you say of course?
Why do you not say of course? Because we're founded on we the people.
But so real change would start from the bottom up.
It does start from the bottom up.
It does start from the bottom.
Yeah.
What are some other thoughts? Yeah. Oh, yes.
I think there's more of a sense of ownership at the ground, at the earlier, lower levels, and I think that's really important for people to become active.
You wanted to say something, didn't you? No. How about some of you silent folks? What do y'all think? Do y'all think that the system is a fair one that we have right now? Does it generate a nice choice of people to vote for, or what do y'all think? Yeah. And then I'll come up.
I don't think we have nice choices because we have a conflict orientation.
Adversarial.
Adversarial. You have the parties really running things. The Constitution itself said that representatives should represent as closely the opinions of those who elected them. But whether it's gerrymandering or closed primaries, which lock out sometimes the preference of the majority of the voters, or those who would like to vote but don't want to go to a primary where it's hardcore ideologues, the options have us just coming at everything from a system that's rigged by the parties and rigged, therefore, more by corporations.
One of the things I came away from my Constitution Café project, which is still ongoing, but I didn't realize that I was among the Americans who hadn't scrutinized the Constitution as thoroughly as I should. But our Constitution gives us the right, as it exists right now, to have one member of Congress for every 30,000 constituents. Did you know that? It's right there right now. Instead, we have one member of Congress for about every 720,000 constituents. So I'm wondering how we can diminish that adversarial conflict relationship when they've got basically these fiefdoms, and once they're in, it's really hard to get them out, because how can you be the ear for 720,000 people?
Oh, yeah. And then, of course, once they're elected and in Congress, the first thing they vote on, they take an oath to uphold the Constitution, but the very next thing is, along party lines, the rules and regs, what's going to help the majority, what's going to help the minority, and, you move further along. The way that things move in Congress is more partisan, is more the majority has all the power. The way that the committee heads are set up is not based on knowledge and experience. It's based on how much you've supported your party. Different lecterns for Republicans and Democrats, and the sort of 3 working days during the week where congressional members aren't talking to one another, and so there's this demonization of the other side, and it's happening. It's happening in our communities. It's happening in Congress. The media is not helping because it's helpful to them to know their audience and feed their audience, and their audience regurgitates, and they're producing opinion among us.
And this as unique as we might think the times are, this happened pretty early on. I mean, between the election between Jefferson and Adams in 1800, oh my gosh, they went at it hammer and tongs and demonized each other and deliberately distorted so very early on there was this kind of tradition. I mean, the political party system arose pretty quickly, even though originally there hadn't been any anticipation of that.
Well, there was more overlap in factions or parties back then, and there was warning against having a steadfast split. It was more, factions based on issues.
But is there any way to mitigate that adversarial sort of tradition? We can point to these sort of 2 pretty corporate-driven parties, but I'm wondering if that's even the big problem.
Madison said we had to do it this way, but I vote for you. You run for something.
Well, what would you do, really? What can we do?
Various states have passed by citizens' initiatives, by referendums, open primaries, where if you run for the Democratic Party and you lose, you cannot therefore represent the party in the general election, but you can still run. So let's say more people wanted you, and this happened in Utah. There was, who was it running for senator? Bennett versus one of the crazy Republicans that's now in Congress. He was Lee. Yes, Mike Lee. If you have the hardcore Dems and the hardcore Republicans showing up in a primary, right? So they vote for the guy who's most hardcore. And then in the general, you have the most hardcore representing, because in a closed primary, only the winners in a closed primary system, only the winners can go on to the general. But the way that Lieberman ended up representing was because Connecticut has an open primary system where he could lose in the primary, but then he could run as an independent. More people in the state wanted him in than any other. Changes things. Yes. And that's just not constitutional, in my opinion. It's not representative.
Wait, Pat.
But you still can hear me. You can still hear me.
And then I'll come to you.
Oh, okay. So that you can gerrymander so that both parties are relatively evenly split in a district. So the people who win appeal to both parties, and they tend to be more moderate people. You can also do what we do here in Takoma Park for local elections, which is grade the electors. So you can put all of your votes for one person, or you can spread them out. And in those instances, you tend more to get someone who's middle of the road and therefore will talk to the other side than these entrenched people.
You wanted to say something?
I'm still thinking about why people are turned off by elections and don't show up. I mean, I missed one election in my lifetime when I was sick and there was a snowstorm and I felt really bad about it. But I try to think about legitimate reasons why people feel turned off by the system. And I'm thinking back to local elections, and I agree that things begin locally and happen locally. One other aspect, I think, is that something happens to many people when they become candidates.
What do you mean by that?
People whose records I have followed in office, whose careers I have followed locally and admire and want to support, when they become all of a sudden a candidate with a big C, say for county executive, this will be coming up locally in the next, and the election is gearing up already. I have seen it up close. In the last county executive election, one candidate early on declared candidacy, and I was thrilled. And I just wrote him a check for $100. I mean, I was happy and sent it. And it was a lot of money for me to send right at the beginning. And so I got on his list, and I got invited to events at which he was going to talk to his supporters. And all of a sudden, the only subject of conversation was raising money. Mm. Even among people whose stands on the issues I admired, I followed their voting records and so on, when they became a candidate with a big C, somehow they bought into the system, and it was all about raising money and then raising more money and then getting more people to send. And I was so put off by this. I still voted for the candidate because there was no one else I wanted to support, but with greatly diminished enthusiasm. And I see this so much that the communications I get from candidates, I look first to see if there's an envelope enclosed. I would be thrilled to get a communication that talked about issues, priorities, ideas, heaven help us, and without any envelope enclosed for sending anything back. That would impress me greatly.
That's, what do y'all think about that? What do y'all think? I'm going to put you on the spot. Just about... Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I haven't voted ever. I'm 17. I'll be voting next year. But yeah, I mean, I think I go to a high school that's the students are very politically motivated.
They are.
Yeah, I'm president of the Young Democrats Club at my school. And we do a lot of kind of trying to get the word out and stuff. And a lot of just the students at my school are very, very interested in politics. And so definitely this election cycle is, especially with Trump as the candidate, people were very involved. And I think people...
How are y'all involved? Y'all can't vote.
A lot of my friends campaigned for Clinton and did some kind of door-to-door stuff in, actually not Maryland, but in Pennsylvania and Virginia.
Did any of them feel the burn?
A lot of them felt the burn. A lot of them were sad when the primaries were over, but kind of quickly shifted their focus to the Clinton campaign. Yeah, voter registration drives that we do.
Okay.
But, yeah.
How about you?
Well, I was listening carefully to the conversation about the education system because, again, I think, especially in the Takoma Park, Montgomery County bubble, we are particularly lucky because national, state, and local politics or government is a required class for all the students.
It is a requirement.
And we're lucky enough at the school where Gemma goes that it's very well taught. And I'd say, actually, she also had the opportunity to take a comparative government class. And I think through the discussions at home about how other countries do it, we've also learned an awful lot about our system. So I almost think that people should not only be studying our system, they should be studying the alternatives and considering what works better.
Interesting. Can you give it back to your daughter?
Yeah.
So what do you think do you think that you're not old enough that you should have to wait till you're 18 to vote?
I definitely think they should lower it to 16, honestly.
Why?
In Takoma Park, you can vote for the mayor when you're 16.
Can you run for mayor?
I do not think you can run for mayor. I think you do have to be 18 to run for mayor. I'm pretty sure. I should look back at that. But there's a county or a city in kind of Western Maryland that they had the youngest mayor ever elected. Period. He was elected when he was 19. But yeah, I definitely think that young people, there's a lot of posters in my school that I see that say, old enough to care, too young to vote. And I definitely think that rings true for us because we felt like these policies are going to be affecting us in the near future when we are 18 and adults and having to live on our own. But yet we can't make it or give our say in who.
There's like in Brazil, you can vote in federal elections at 16. There was a movement in Germany to lower it to 11. There was a congressman retired now in California, Vasconcelos, who wanted to lower the voting age. The Constitution says nothing about voting age. And even though there now is an amendment that says, you can start voting at age 18, state legislatures, I don't know if y'all know this, but you can go to your legislature, y'all can lower it to any age that you want. You can bring down to any age. I made the argument, and it got me booted off one public radio program. I used to be a regular. I said that we should lower the voting age to the lowest documented age that somebody served in the American Revolution, because it was typically the youngest member who went to serve rather than the oldest sibling, because they were considered too vital for the farm. And so it was documented. Andrew Jackson enlisted as a volunteer at 13. Risked life and limb and was slashed to the bone after taking prisoner. There's if you look at that iconic Spirit of 76 painting, Fife and Drum, one of them is very young. They marched through the thick of war without any weapon to defend themselves to help guide the troops. But they couldn't vote then, and they can't vote now, yet they risked it all for that same promise of all men are created equal. But a friend of mine recently came out with a book on citizen power, and he booted me off his Twitter page when I made the proposal that we should lower the voting age, even though my journeys show that young people are often much, much more astute than a lot. So I've gotten a lot of flack for supporting. I think we should, and then I'll get the argument, well, no, young people are too impressionable. Those studies show that older folks are very deeply, by negative ads influence. And I also get the thing, well, they don't vote now when they turn 18. I say, well, maybe if we lowered it, they'd feel more involved instead of just suddenly throwing it at them.
But what is that based on? I mean, if you're saying only astute people should, we want to get astute people to vote and nobody else.
I'm not saying that.
Are you going to decide, or it's. I actually have qualms about kind of the mentality that's been driving that lowering voting age, because I think it has inadvertently disconnected the concept of responsibilities and rights. I would be happy to put my fate or whatever in the hands of a lot of very young people. I mean, that's not the issue.
I put mine in yours. I get the feeling you're more mature than I am.
but that really isn't the issue. I mean, and we also don't raise our children the way they were raised in the 17th century to be warriors when they were 10. And so it's not that we should raise 10-year-olds to be warriors. The point is, maybe we should think about all these interconnected parts.
And I certainly wouldn't advocate for the warrior part. But if we are sort of inured at a much younger age to be deeply civically engaged, extrapolating from that in modern times, I just wonder, if the world is what you make of it, why does it have to be put off? Because all ages are arbitrary.
Well, we don't
to a certain degree.
Children to until they're 18 take responsibility for their actions, and we don't want to. I mean, we do and we don't.
We do and don't. Some people serve
we disconnect
life sentences at 14
from them. Sometimes they do, and often we say that's kind of an atrocity. So we just need to think about the parts.
Yes, thank you. Yes, okay. And I'll come back to you.
Well, I just had I guess my thought about reducing the voting age would be good, because at least for some number of people that go off to school at 18 or whatever, well, then at that point you're actually potentially in another place. You're disconnected from wherever you are. If you had learned, and we all are people of habit for the most part, and so starting habits early, but so starting it when you're still connected to a community, that you're connected to other people saying, well, what do you think? What do you think? Because when you get to school, again, this is for people who go off to school, you have no idea what's going on where you are. So that's a particularly bad time for one group of people going away to school. I realize it's a small part, but it is a very curious time to get the vote, which is a time that you have no clue what's going on. And I mean, the other point, or another one, which just connected to one of my daughters who was in school in Canada has remarked a couple of times how little engagement colleges have, how few protests in the United States, whereas in Canada and European countries, the universities are the center for protest and social movements.
Mm-hmm.
And she was just going,
the same where my wife is from in Mexico.
What? She was like, what is it about in the United States that the universities are not the centers for, again, sort of protests or social movements? She just remarked on it. She was like, what would
your take be on that?
I was, I was like, I don't know. Where I was, it was about sports and drinking beer, so they were clueless.
I sort of came at the generation we weren't asked to do anything. I think our clarion call was
in the 60s, though.
Yeah. I was born in 59, so our big clarion call was you have to fight for your right to party.
No.
So that wasn't I didn't have to even register for possible conscription at my age. Yes, ma'am.
I would wonder if the argument for a younger age for voting would say at 16 would be very good because it would integrate the whole political questions of community and larger communities into the schools much better, and would cause there to be a much greater a real push for having civics education in the high schools.
Do you know that's the first time I've heard that?
But I think that would be a very good reason to lower the age to 16.
It would
and
certainly
that might
put schools
help us
right in the nexus of...
in the nexus of, yes. And then I think then you move to the other, I think that that goes with the other question of the money, which is such a huge problem. But I think those two...
And how does it tie in with the money?
Well, because money is so powerful, and the way, if you can get more people involved earlier, we're talking all this evening, how do we get people involved? How do we increase the electorate? How do we get more people involved in the civic discourse? We need to get people involved. And if we start earlier, I think we have a better chance. If we can get rid of some of the money, then we have a better chance.
So lowering the voting age would actually almost ipso facto involve schools in the whole civics education process.
Exactly,
in a very direct way.
And here's another thought. What happens that I ask, I don't know this, but I think that in Europe, the political campaigns are funded by the government, at least in some places. What about the idea of having equal funding for the parties by the government instead of allowing...
it's also true of, North America includes Canada, U.S., and Mexico. Their government also funds, and they have a viable 4-party system now.
4-party system.
Yes.
In Canada. Uh-huh.
Yes, but yes,
Wow.
it is. Yes, let me
Oh, I was just wondering about just knowing that, because I went to school in Canada, and the price of admission is a lot lower than it is here, and perhaps there's a lot of corporate involvement in U.S. universities, and maybe that's why they're not as political, for fear of alienating donors or other entities. And I think Mexico is also very affordable.
I couldn't hear the last part.
Just that college is more expensive in the U.S. and that there might be fear of alienating corporations involved in.
So the corporate, again, money.
I don't know.
That's an interesting point of view. Yeah, it seems that most of the things when there's student protests these days, at least from the sources I go to, it's more about pretty vociferous, if not violent, protest of a speaker is invited whose views differ with versus the activist sort of role that they used to play, right? In the 60s, 70s?
Right. I mean, the anti-war protests, at least at one point, I don't have a feeling for, throughout, looking at the United States in general, the student protest movements, or student movements, I don't think they were, again, my feeling is they're not as strong. There's not a tradition of that in the States as there is in other countries.
I think taking the draft away was a big mistake.
You think taking the draft away was a big mistake?
I'm glad it was because I didn't want certainly wouldn't want my children to.
But in what sense was it a mistake?
Because then you have this military group over here, and the rest of the citizenry really doesn't have to worry about whether they get killed or not, whether they joined, it's their problem. But when in my generation, that dates me, I'm sure, at least all the guys had to worry about the Vietnam War.
And the difference that makes in our overall citizen
makes you much more involved. We were out on the streets. We were protesting. Our parents were protesting because they worried about us.
Parents across the political spectrum.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that was as much as we don't.
It's much harder to make a war if
it's your child.
Yeah.
I think there's only 1 or 2 members of Congress who have children serving actively in the military, and I wonder how that tinges, the votes.
I've always thought that those senators
When was the last time we voted for a president who served in the military, active military? Somebody know? Elected.
Okay.
When was the last president who?
George H.
But in the active military?
Yes. Senior.
Senior. Okay. George H.W. Bush. Wow. So, okay. Yeah. So what about the two-party system? Again, the Constitution didn't anticipate that, yet a system of parties quickly arose about 11 years after the Constitution was ratified, the second Constitution that we go by now. What are your thoughts about that? Is it an impediment to democratic evolution today, or are there things that we can fix again without necessarily trying to get constitutional amendments so that it's a system that we all think is a viable one? Any thoughts about that? How about you? You haven't said anything.
I haven't said anything?
Yeah.
I'll say something when I'm ready.
Okay. Yeah. I always. Yeah.
But thank you for asking.
I do. I just like to make sure everybody has a chance. Yeah.
I'm not shy.
Yeah. Okay.
I just wanted to say that I think the nature of the way the electoral system is set up with like how we in most districts, there's a few, I think it's like Maine and Nebraska that use like a proportional representation system, but we use like a single member district plurality system where we just vote for a candidate and whoever wins the plurality of the votes in that district just gets to be the winner and everyone else loses. And if your preferred person loses, then you've lost out. So it definitely like creates this system where you want to kind of strategically vote. So you vote for someone who a lot of people might vote for. So it kind of pushes kind of two parties sort of in the center. And I would say that it would be hard to change that kind of two-party system unless we change the electoral system as well. So
then we would have to make an amendment to do away with the electoral college,
or pass legislation in our own districts that use not winner take all.
Are there those here who feel like the electoral system is now its time is that it's because 2 of the last 5 elections the person with the largest number of votes did not win. Is that something of concern, or is that important to give each state sort of an integrity that was vital? Yes, ma'am.
Hillary won the popular vote, and it would take a constitutional amendment ratified by, I forget the number of states, but the majority, in order to change that system. But it would equalize people's votes. The system was set up so that more rural areas, bigger states with fewer people have more power in their votes than people who live on the East Coast corridor of heavy population. And
So I think that we have to work towards a resolution of this problem by introducing it as being important, that we take away the ability of several states to have a disproportionate impact on the election.
So do you think that, how many people here feel that the time has come to revisit the Electoral College? That it's not, whether the candidate who's elected is one you do not favor, because it's easier to say it when it's the candidate is who lost is the one that we favored. Would you still favor that change, even if it would turn the tables?
Yes.
Yeah. Because yes. I mean, some others. Who else wanted to say? And then I'll come over here. I feel like Phil.
I think that the rural areas already have more than their share of power just because they have 2 senators. Whereas the populated states also have the same, so they already have more power in the government.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
There's been proposals that would keep the Electoral College, but just change the number of elector, whatever you call them, that you'd get. And I find myself ambivalent, but I do worry that if you got rid of the Electoral College, you would, if you lived in Nevada, there'd be no reason to go to the polls. And the concerns of the less populated states are usually your farm agriculture states. They have concerns that the New Yorkers and basically the elections would be the 5 biggest cities in the United States would determine the elections. If there were statistically, I think I read.
So even though it might benefit you personally, you think
you would
that...
I would like it because
yeah.
Hillary would be in and not Trump and a lot of it. But I do feel that it would disenfranchise certain areas of the country.
Okay. Yeah. Did you want to say something? Any other thoughts?
It just seemed to me that the popular vote would have the opposite effect that you were describing. It would actually enfranchise everybody equally. Wouldn't matter whether your vote was in Nevada or New York City.
For the president. No?
Well, I mean, it was all 50 states, right?
States aren't an issue when you get rid of
Yeah, when you go to electoral college, it's all 50 states. So, but I guess like to say the framers did have the idea that some smaller states would be a problem, and of course now it seems like the opposite is that they are the problem because it's the tail wagging the dog. So.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, I have a question. I have another thing about the voters in general. Is that everyone here we're very privileged people, and so I mean if we can't have democracy, nobody does. But there are other classes of people, over in Langley Park, down in Anacostia, back in Appalachia, they don't feel so franchised. And I know, but like
how many of you don't
course.
feel franchised in some way, shape, or form? How many of you pretty much feel that you are?
We have good members of Congress.
We
do have representation.
You do.
We do. We have excellent senators, and we have a great House of Representatives. So we're cool. I think, but it behooves us to go elsewhere and help people register, get to the polls.
So they can be feel we're cool too.
Same privileges that we have.
So it seems like it still is all sort of boils down to we the people, that we want others to have what we have if we do feel that we're.
Price of liberty.
But I think that's here, but that's not necessarily everywhere because I don't know that the true impact of money, because Maryland is such a democratic state, but other states where it's more mixed, and you have the influence of money, the influence of gerrymandering. I mean, we have gerrymandering here in Maryland too, but I think that's where sort of the effect of money can make such a big difference.
It's not as democratic as it once was. I mean, it has voted for.
We have had 2 Maryland governors who are Republicans since I've lived here.
Yeah, even some places like so I go to Appalachia during the election season, and there's a few TV stations and everything, but the news they report gets mixed with the little ads. So where does the news begin and the
going
ad
back
begin?
to information.
Yeah. So they don't get all that great of information, and whatever it is like, well, the thing about it is you have to be for coal, because even if it's going to choke everybody else, you have to be for that. And why can't you be for solar? And there are a few Appalachians who are for solar and are for wind energy and so forth, and especially people in parts of Virginia where they want to put these new pipelines through. Well, I mean, if you're going to put the pipeline through my backyard, then I can be for solar and I can be for wind, and they are. It's pretty amazing.
Thank you. Yes.
I have 2 questions about the presidential election and the electoral college related. First of all, I'd like to know why we can't just have a straight popular vote for the president. And the second part of it is, I understand what the rationale for the electoral college was at the beginning, but it doesn't seem to me that the electoral college functions the way it was proposed to function. In other words, if the electors are not going to really vote their conscience, which they never do almost, then there's no point to the electoral college that I can think of.
Okay. Anybody else want to say something? Who hasn't any? Yes. Yes, sir. Mr. McGann.
So, a couple of things. I would tell you, you are absolutely right. The Electoral College does not work the way it was intended to work. But that's a state law. The states determine how the Electoral Colleges vote. I don't live in Maryland. I live in a different state. And our state mandates by law that the Electoral College has to vote for. I'm not defending it. I'm just saying this is a local decision, right? This has nothing to do with the Constitution. This is what the local people decided. So there's that. Yeah. So, and I'm definitely would not support the idea of the popular election. I grew up in rural towns. I grew up in rural states. I think that I agree with you 100%. 6 cities would control elections almost always. Yeah, they have the population. Look at the numbers.
Not everybody in New York is a Democrat.
Well, no, not everybody is. But if you look at percentages, it is pretty profound in large cities run Democratic side. Point. But the point that I wanted to talk about, though, we keep coming back to money, right? And money is a huge issue. But I want us to understand that we are just as swayed by the corporations as those evil parties are. Don't think for a minute you are not swayed, but think of all the different advertising you're exposed to on any given day. Think of all the different advertising mottos you know. What is just do it? We know who that is? I'm loving it. Do you know what that is?
No.
You don't know McDonald's? You're a lucky man.
I'm going to look at a McDonald's ad.
Well, we're exposed to it, so
even sometimes though we say things we don't even realize the corporate source. I think is
so. I think that we are by all means swayed, and they have it, and they have an agenda, and it ain't us. I can promise you that. So don't think that taking the money out of a party, which I'm totally in favor of. Don't get me wrong. Well, that's not going to solve the problem. That's just going to shift the problem, right? And all that because they're still going to spend the same amount of money. They're just going to do it a different way. So I'm not trying to be nihilistic, but at the same point, I don't want to be optimistic and think that if the Citizens United was overturned, the world would be different. Because let's be clear, the world isn't that much different today than it was 3 years ago.
Well, what do you think we need shorter election times? 8 weeks. That's it. TV ads limited to 8 weeks.
Well, okay, now you've changed your scenario.
Process.
how could you tell someone not to run for office? You could tell someone not to campaign.
Okay, public campaign.
Public campaign, I think that's a great idea. Yeah. I think it's a hugely great idea.
You know, those are, that brings to mind two things. She left, the young woman who spoke about the fact that if you run in one of the major party primaries, but you can quickly switch over to an independent. It's not so easy in the federal election for president. And I wonder if it had been more easy if you had a lot of people following you, but you didn't win that party, if you could have quickly switched over and run a viable independent campaign.
Lost parole.
He did. Anderson. The other thing was, there's the state that I'm going from here tomorrow. I'm going to Maine, where I started out my writing life and lots of other things, where they still have these things called town meetings. Their electoral system, and it's a very important point, and I believe Wyoming as well, that they divvy up the electoral vote based on who won the majority in a congressional district. So it's not just the statewide winner take all that it is, but it's every state could do that if they wanted to. That's actually a state right that only two exercise that I know of, Wyoming and Maine. So it's quite often it is that they'll divide up their in Nebraska. Okay, so maybe that's what I'm thinking of actually.
We call that disarming.
Yeah, but so there are some things that we can do again in the existing system that we have to make things.
I was just thinking of another mechanism that people have proposed, where that you'd pass state by state laws requiring that the state would give all of its electoral votes to the national winner of the popular vote.
Oh, yeah.
That's been a proposal. And people would agree to that on a state.
Do you like that idea?
It seems better. Seems in the right direction.
Okay. Well, time flies when we're philosophizing. Y'all have totally shown that we don't have short attention spans, and maybe it's just what we've been talking about is what keeps people's attention spans short. But that this is something. We arrived at no final answers, so I consider this a rousing success. But to me, quite honestly, I think that just by coming together and having these thoughtful back and forths can make us more prompted to be involved in civic life. And I think that this is a very important stepping stone to that. I'm deeply grateful to this wonderful library for having had me here now for nearly 20 years, coming here on and off. And I want to thank you so much. Thank you. And I want to, of course, you all, if you leave me your email, I will send you an envelope. Yeah. But hopefully we can
find that on your website.
Exactly. So our website is either socratescafe.com or democracycafe.org. And there's something very important about this, especially right now, that we can just come together and have a kind of thoughtful discourse that hopefully does make us want to be more engaged. And I think some of the what I find very heartening about nearly every idea proposed is we can do these things without having to change anything in our existing Constitution on a state or federal level. And these are things that we can be inspired to do. So thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you all again next time.